else, and I'm sorry, there is not. So I find the idea that the materium is thought of as illusionary, holographic, to be holographic has some validity simply because of the replication issues. But the idea that it's illusionary is really kind of silly. True, it is illusionary, but there is no material there other than the illusion. So we're trapped inside the magician's hat trick, and everybody thinks, oh, we're trapped inside the hat trick, we can go out and join the audience. And nope, I'm sorry, we are the audience and the trick all simultaneously. And so if you are not in the trick, you're nowhere, because there is nowhere except in the materium. See, the space only exists inside the materium that we create. So we've created this aquarium, the materium, and we create it, and we create the stuff inside of it by sending a pulse through it that bounces through it and comes back and crosses itself and then crosses itself again. And the way I usually explain it is I say that the 22 trillion times a second, a pulse comes from the center of the universe and it goes to the center of every single galaxy. Since it travels outside of time, it does so with no time. It's there instantly. And it goes from the middle of every single galaxy to the middle of every single solar system, and from the middle of every single solar system, it goes to every single item in that solar system, including all of us, and every single atom of dust, and even the non-atoms that are in the process of creating. And it does this 22 trillion times a second. Now, 22 trillion times a second, it does not pulse, and everything ceases, and the materium does not exist. So 22 trillion times a second, you don't exist. But that happens so fast, you're not aware of it. You're only aware of the 22 trillion times a second that you actually do exist. And if you wanted to think of it, you could think of it in a particular way. A nice little analogy is that you see, bearing in mind, of course, that your eyes are being created 22 trillion times a second so that they can see the light that's also being created to infiltrate and come into your brain that's also being created at 22 trillion times a second, all to receive this. And but you see, basically, because what's going on is that 22 trillion times a second, let's just look at it as a flash. Light comes into existence, and there is persistence of human vision. And so we maintain our memories across the 22 trillion times a second gap in which we don't exist physically. This actually is what allows for movement. If you think about it, and that the materium were actually populated with physical hard atoms that continued to exist, eventually it would fill up with atoms, and all the atoms would run into each other, and it would just melt down in a giant friction because they would not be able to shift or move anywhere without running into another atom and causing friction. And the whole universe would go poof in a giant conflagration simply on the frictional level of it. But the materium doesn't exist that way. We're truly 22 trillion times a second. We don't exist. This is called the void, by the way. This is where you can go and do interesting meditative things, but that isn't the point of today's discussion. The point of today's discussion is to talk about timelines and time in its nature. So in my way of thinking, time started when the very first atom was created in materium. Unlike the Big Bang Theory, like the Big Bang Theory, I postulate that 14 billion years ago or thereabouts, time is immaterial, numbers are for monkey minds, so it doesn't really matter. But some bazillion years back, a single atom came into existence, only I don't think of it as the size of a pea or anything. I think of it as a negatively charged hydrogen ion. Came into existence and winked out almost instantly, but of course in the process of winking out, it was also joined by about several million other hydrogen ions, all in a cohort, because that was the creation of the materium. And it just started and it's never stopped. We are in a continuously creating itself reality. This is the little bloop model is the shorthand for it, or you could call it the continuous creation destruction model of reality. Because we're continuously creating reality 22 trillion times a second, 22 trillion times a second, we destroy it. But you can also think of it as the little bloop model, because we started off as a single hydrogen ion that went bloop and came into existence, looked around and then left. But in the process of leaving it, as I say, several million of its fellows also went bloop and came into existence, and everybody's been going bloop ever since. And we've been bloop, 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 and filling up the whole planet, and then the whole solar system, and then the whole galaxy, and then the whole universe, and all of the other galaxies. And see, this can go on infinitely. There is no space. There's no envelope in which we must infill, which is the Big Bang Theory. Now, in the little bloop theory, there's no time either. because time and space both exist at the level of each little bloop when they come into existence. So that very first little bloop brought in a hydrogen ion, and it brought with it a little tiny amount of space, just enough for it to come into, and a little tiny bit of time, just enough time for it to exist in. And when its time was over, it stopped and ceased to exist. In other words, its template didn't continue. So if we look at it this way, it had a little template, and 22 trillion times a second, the pulse checked with it and said, hey, should I create you again? And at one point, the little molecule said, nope, my time's done. And so the universe didn't create it anymore. And that happened in what we would think of as milliseconds, or probably nanomilliseconds. Time being so incredibly fine at how we can parse it. It's one of the finest things of division in our reality. So anyway, so every single atom that comes into existence brings its time with it. Now here's the really interesting thing. It brings gravity and all these other aspects which were defined or enumerated by, I can't think of the guy's name now, but it's in Sanskrit, and they enumerated 66,000 aspects that come into reality with the appearance of each atom. They didn't phrase it that way, but we can think of it that way. And so some of these aspects include, heat, cold, solid, soft, fluid, movement, all of these different kinds of things, colors, etc. And of course, every single atom that comes on into existence brings along with it time. Now, as an aside, if we note these guys over there in CERN that are got that big donut in the ground, and they're smashing little particles at each other. They're trying to bust the particles up and get at some of the subparticles to basically screw with the little tiny time components that come along with it. And so they're sort of in supporting my idea of terms of how time exists. The time is part of the particle and not part of the matrix in which the particle exists. Or it's part of the wave and not part of the matrix in which the wave exists. In any event, so it won't really yield them the results that they think they're going to get, but that's because they think of time in the timeline sense. They think of time as some form of a force that's emanating out of a central area that is independent of the molecules, washes over the molecules, and makes all the molecules behave in a certain way. So that's how the scientists academically consider time. That's how time is thought of as in a general consensus sense, that we all think of, the rivers of time, rowing your boat down the stream of time, and all of this kind of thing. Now, there's some problems with that view of the time in its very nature, and timelines in particular. And this actually goes to the point of some of the points I'll make here in a minute, so we might as well stop and discuss it. In the larger timeline sense, where there's the idea of a blue shirt Courtney Brown and a red shirt Courtney Brown, etc., talking to different versions of you, with you wearing different versions of clothes, that version of timeline idea assumes that time is independent of your body, and assumes that time is basically independent of all of the materium around it, and in essence flows through and acts on the material within the materium. If we want to think of it this way, pushing it, so to speak, from the now into the past, or from the future through the now into the past. And that's the general consensus, and that's how we think of it. Well, I'm sorry to say it's quite wrong, that because there's a central premise to that is false and can be proven to be false with some thought experiments. And that central premise must be that if that were the case, if time were this independent force coming into material reality and washing over and making all of material reality behave a certain way, as the scientists and academics would have you believe, and which would support the idea of a multiple timeline theory, because there's nothing to stop an infinite variation of timelines within that idea of time being external to the materium. If that were the case, then there's one central thing in there that has to exist, and that is that time has to be uniformly or ubiquitously applied to all items within the materium in order for the materium to coherently progress. So let me stop for a second and delineate a bit of that. Here's the basic understanding of that. If time were this external force washing over the materium, it would be like we would all be standing on a beach, and there would be a wave of time that would come and wash over us. Now, in that sense, there's a central idea there that is absolutely critical to this idea. It's also critical to the idea of string theory. It's also critical to the idea of a expanding Big Bang universe, and it's critical to the idea of dimensions. And this is that there would be, the idea itself is that in our analogy, we're standing on the beach and time is washing over us. Well, if the timeline view, the academic view of time were correct, then time would affect us all equally. And we may not perceive it as affecting us all equally, but the force, the pressure on us would be felt equally, and it would be the same level of pressure that is felt on the sand under our feet. It would be the same level of pressure that would be felt by the other creatures around us, by the atmosphere around us, and so on. It would be required that all things move and react to the time wave in the same, or be at least exposed to the same level of force. Now, some of us might dig our feet into the sand and fight it more, and others may decide to leap into it and go with the flow. And so that would be a subjective response to it, but we would all feel the force of that time the same. And so that is a central premise that is inherent in all the timeline arguments, and we can go and debate that, but if you want to get into any kind of supporting idea for multiple timelines, it will come down to this idea that time is this independent thing or force, and if that's the case, it must be squirted out ubiquitously, because there's no reason to suppose that there's less time being sprayed on Saturn and its inhabitants than there is on Earth and its inhabitants, or there's less time or more time being sprayed on Bangladesh than there is, on Ghana. It just doesn't work that way. The whole planet would feel the time at the same level of pressure, if you will, from the time stream. So I dispute that that is actually the case, and I can prove it because we all demonstrate that that's not the case in our daily activities. Just walking around in a day, we note that, for instance, that everything we do relative to time is all subjective. We have good times, we have bad times. There's our relationship with time is entirely personal, entirely felt, and is entirely subjective. Now, it is true our subjective relationship to time is also wider in its consciousness, or in its effect on our consciousness, than merely the subjective. But it's a collective subjective, if you will. So let's go back to the little bloop theory for a second. When the little bloops of hydrogen ions first started appearing, and we had really a flush of them, all of their time joined together, and for the period of time that from that point on until now, we have had our 14 billion years. The little bloops came into existence and are still coming to existence and are adding time into universe. So the way I'm thinking about it, universe, or the materium, is not slowing down and it'll probably never contract. We're continuing to add to it, and every atom that comes into existence as we expand adds more time into the total mix. And time is very interesting. It's like gravity. I did a discussion some number of weeks back about how gravity is the weak force, because the little bloops, when they come into existence, their gravity only interacts with the gravity that's close to them, and very weakly even beyond those that are close. Now, time is the other way. The time comes in, and it's a very strong force because it interacts with all the other time that's already there interacting with itself. And so every little bit of time joins in the time collective and makes the time collective that much stronger. And it also binds the individual little bits of time to the collective that much harder, because as the collective grows, it becomes stronger. Now, that's time at a, if you will, a mechanistic level. Chronos, the idea of tick, 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 tick from the clocks, I don't think really exists. I think that really is an illusion, which we don't really have to live with. There are other ways to manage things. But basically, time is subjective. Its appearance is entirely personal. It's a felt thing. We all feel time at various different ways, and we experience it in different fashions. And so this tells us that instantly, if we think about it and drill down, that the timeline idea is false. There is no continuing pressure at a constant level that moves us all at the same level of pressure that we would all feel across the entire spectrum of time. So